This and every episode of the Brewlosophy podcast is brought to you by the American Homebrewers Association, a member-driven organization that wants to help you save money on beer and brewing supplies. In addition to providing brewing resources and hosting one-of-a-kind events, the AHA offers money-saving discounts at nearly 2,000 beery destinations around the country through their member deals program. Join the AHA at homebrewersassociation.org and make your beer money go further. Wort might become beer the minute yeast hits it, but there are a few other important things that need to happen before it turns into the delicious beverage we all love so much. As any brewer knows, the completion of fermentation doesn't necessarily mean the beer is ready to drink. No, that usually takes another few days or up to a couple of weeks, during which the final important characteristic develops. This is the Brewlosophy podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and in this episode, contributor Malcolm Frazer is joining me to talk about carbonation. Malcolm, I don't know about you, but I'm a big fan of carbonation in beer. I feel like it's one of those things that without it, I'm not sure I'd be drinking beer as often as I do.
Right, the sparkle fizz component, which adds to some of the theater of beer. You know, that pop sound when we open up the cap, and that fizzle, the bubbles rising to the top, that foam starting to form. That's part of the dramatic aspect of beer, and it's one of the things that separates beer from so many other beverages, especially adult beverages.
That's right. Yeah, the fact that beer is not still, and I think carbonation is one of those things. I've thought a lot about how we got to the point of beer being as carbonated as it is. And, we're not pushing like soda levels in beer or anything like that. But, when you consider kind of the advent of beer in itself and how we've evolved into, knowing as much as we do about it and making the beers that we want, the fact that at some point long ago, somebody was like, if we cap this off and we contain this fizziness, maybe it'll make this stuff that we're making even better. It's just fascinating to me.
Let's chalk it up to another one of those happy accidents, right? And because CO2 is a natural byproduct of fermentation, turns out we liked it.
That's right. I love it. And I'm aware of the argument about carbonation being detrimental to beer flavor. I've heard of that as well. It doesn't seem to be as contended as it used to be just 4 or 5 years ago. Particularly for certain styles, people like English styles maybe to have a little bit less carbonation. But to me, and I'm sure I'm not alone on this, it's a quintessential aspect of every style of beer that I've certainly developed my own opinions on. We're going to get into that. We're going to get into methods of carbonation and some experiment results in just a bit. Hey, listen, if you're planning to attend HomebrewCon in Portland, Oregon from June 28th to June 30th and you haven't yet registered, you've got a few days left to get in on the early bird pricing. I believe it ends April 20th. So get in now, jump on it. We would love to see you there. Don't forget you have to be an AHA member to register, which you can learn more about at brewlosophy.com/AHA or homebrewersassociation.org. We've got all kinds of fun plans set. The evening prior to the conference, Wednesday, June 27th, the Brewlosophy crew is going to be hanging out at Imperial Bottle Shop with Imperial Yeast, who's going to be hosting their Insane in the Yeast Strain event, which is free to attend. You just pay for your beer. There's going to be 12 different beers, all from the same batch of wort and fermented with 12 different yeast strains that are made by Imperial. So it's going to be a lot of fun. The next night, which is the first day of the conference and kind of during the official AHA kickoff party, we're going to be heading out to our annual Brewlosophy karaoke party. It's annual only because we started it last year, and we're going to keep doing it. So, but it's sure to be quite memorable. We're allowing people to get in on the guest list early by making a donation via PayPal to help cover the costs. If you're interested in having a ton of unpretentious fun with us weirdos and a whole crew of other folks, shoot me an email. I'll get you the details. Marshall@brewlosophy.com. We'd love to have you there as well. The list is filling up quite fast, a bit faster than I expected. So a few months ago, we mentioned in a couple of episodes our plans to throw a party with our friends from Yakima Valley Hops during the 2018 hop harvest. Well, unfortunately, we all got a little bit too busy, and we decided that it'd be best for us to postpone the plans for this party, at least for 2018, so that we had more time to plan it out and make sure that it's a really awesome event. It's definitely still, on our list of things to get to, but we're just not going to be able to do it this year for the 2018 hop harvest. However, that does not mean that we're not going to throw it down this year. Some of us from the Brewlosophy crew, right now it's just Brian Hall and myself, we're going to be heading up to Yakima for the 16th annual Fresh Hop Ale Festival. It's happening on September 29th. We're going to be up there the whole weekend, but it looks like a really amazing event. I've been following along on Facebook, and I'm just getting super excited to be up there. I've been talking to the guys from Yakima Valley Hops. I think we might set up some cool interviews and whatnot for the podcast. So, but if you're going to be around and you're looking for something to do at the end of September, head up there. Yakima is the place to be during the hop harvest. So many cool events going on. So many industry folks around. A ton of fun. I'm really looking forward to going up there again this year. So, all right. Thanks to everyone who's taken the time to bookmark and use the links found at brewlosophy.com/support. You may not realize how much that simple little gesture helps us out. If you are looking for a way to easily support what we're up to, please consider using those links as well. You won't feel a thing, and we get a little bit of coin from those sponsors for referring you to their websites. For those who want something in return for their support, check out the rewards you can get for becoming a patron at patreon.com/brewlosophy. Never before published contributor recipes, unique and fun discounts at Yakima Valley Hops, monthly video chats with the Brewlosophy crew, and perhaps our most popular reward, an invite to a monthly livecast Q&A session with an extra special guest. We've already had Mike Tonsmeyer and John Palmer on. That was amazing. And the guest for this month is none other than BJCP Grandmaster Judge Gordon Strong. Malcolm, I know you know Gordon quite well.
He was just at our homebrew competition, and he mentioned how he was going to be doing this while in Brazil. So he'll be in Brazil, and I warned him to do a dry run with the software, even though he is a computer guy. Just the fact that he's not a Facebook guy. People who know Gordon know that he's kind of social media shy. So I just told him to give it a dry run. That's all.
Yeah. He's not a Facebook guy, and the only way we were able to get him on is I had to set up a burner account for him. This is no joke.
He said he agreed to it because the cool sound of having a burner Facebook, very Mission Impossible-esque, like. After this live cast, this profile will no longer exist.
It will no longer exist. Yeah, I told him I would download the video and re-upload it under my username. But I'm really grateful to Gordon for agreeing to do this. We've got some other rad guests lined up to do the Q&A live cast over the next year. We've got Charlie Bamforth, which I'm just so excited to have him on. I've been talking to the folks at Russian River about getting Vinny Chilurzo on to answer questions about making, Pliny the Elder and other great beers that they make. So go check it out. Patreon.com/brewlosophy, all kinds of cool rewards. And we really do appreciate the support. Finally, please remember to subscribe to this podcast and then go and rate and review it wherever it is you are listening to the podcast. That feedback is super helpful for us. We do read every bit of feedback that we get and all of the reviews, and the ratings help people who don't currently know about us to find us. And it's been helping. I'm hearing from a ton of people who had never heard of brewlosophy.com who are finding us through this podcast. So I really do appreciate you guys leaving those ratings. Thanks to everyone who's taken the time to do that already. Okay, it's time for a little bit of feedback, which this week is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who specialize in tri-clover compatible sanitary fittings, conical fermenters, kettles, and brew stands. Brewers Hardware offers a variety of unique and hard-to-find items for both the home and craft brewing markets, including high-quality stainless fittings at competitive prices and very fast shipping. They're really excited to announce the release of the BCS 482 control system. I took a look at this thing online. It's crazy. 8 temperature inputs, 8 discrete inputs, 16 discrete outputs. The BCS 482 provides everything needed to fully automate your brewery. Learn more about this and the other great gear they offer at brewershardware.com. And don't forget to mention Brewlosophy at checkout to receive a free little gift. That's brewershardware.com. All right. So Todd Riley from Onalaska, Wisconsin, I think I'm saying that correctly, writes in to say, you stated on a prior episode that you carbonate water for you and your wife. I'm thinking that's a great idea. Can you explain your process? The base water you use, any water salts or acid additions, PSI settings, all of that stuff. I'm assuming we would dose the servings individually with fruit flavors. Thank you so much for all the Brewlosophy team does for your fellow homebrewers. Jersey and Tim are a riot. Well, Todd, I'm glad you like Jersey and Tim. I do too, very much so. Yes, my wife and I love sparkling water, and I've been making my own for a while now. It's super easy. I'm fortunate enough to have pretty clean water where I live, so I generally just run 5 gallons through a standard RV filter directly into a sanitized keg, then proceed from there. For fun, I did once mineralize my water to be as close to San Pellegrino as possible, and it tasted fine, but it was no better than my unadulterated carbonated water, so we've just been sticking with that. But my process for getting it carbonated is honestly a piece of cake. First thing I usually do is open up or pour myself a beer, and then I fill a keg with 5 gallons of filtered water using a potable hose. Make sure you sanitize your keg, clean it out and sanitize it really well. You don't want any weird beer flavors in your carbonated water. Once the keg is full and I've put the lid on, I hit it with 50 PSI of gas, and I keep the gas attached, and then I agitate the keg for a full 10 minutes. And that's why I have the beer out there. This gets really boring. So I'm usually listening to yacht rock music and drinking a beer while I'm agitating the keg. I then put the keg with the gas still attached and set to 50 PSI in my cold Keezer and leave it there overnight. So, 10 to 15 hours or so before I reduce the gas down to about 20 PSI and start drinking the water. It's usually very, very fizzy at that point. But I found that the carbonation seems to stabilize a little bit and maybe get a little bit finer after 3 or 4 days sitting at 20 PSI. That could just be my imagination. But once it's there, so after 2 or 3 days at 20 PSI, I'll usually reduce the gas to about 15 PSI just to reduce it makes pouring a little bit easier and keeps more of that carbonation. Again, it seems to keep more of that carbonation in solution. As far as mixing fruit juices and stuff like that in, we've, kind of experimented with like tart cherry juice, fruit concentrates. We got a fruit concentrate at last year's HomebrewCon, actually, like blood orange. We've done that. I wasn't a big fan of either of those. My wife and I just generally, we'll like squeeze some lemon into a glass and then drop the piece of fruit in there and then just pour the water on top of it. And that's what we prefer. But, Malcolm, you ever make carbonated water?
Yeah, I used to have it on tap quite a bit. Haven't so much lately, but I just did what you did. I tried doing RO or DI, carbonating the piss out of it and then adding minerals. And, I do 3 or 4 grams of calcium chloride and a little bit of baking soda. And that was good, but I just found carbonating tap water that was well filtered was easier. So I did that. Yeah.
And I don't think it tastes that much. It's weird because, water chemistry obviously has an impact on beer, but it doesn't seem to be it wasn't in terms of preference, at least.
It wasn't bold enough for me to care because the easiness of just taking filtered tap water and putting it in a keg, was all I cared about.
Yeah, exactly.
As far as fruiting it and flavoring it, I just do muddled fruit in the bottom of a glass, just a couple wedges of fruit X and just, smash it up and then pour water on top of it. Done.
Yeah, it's easy. Another thing that my wife has messed around with is dosing the carbonated water with those it's like a sugar-free concentrate, Mio or something like that. I'm not into that sugar-free flavor, so I wasn't a big fan, but it does make it taste more like soda. My kids kind of enjoy it, so that's another option. But yeah, making carbonated water is a piece of cake, and you can actually do that with more than just water. For my daughter's 6th birthday party, we made a 3-gallon keg of fresh squeezed carbonated lemonade. That was a huge hit. It was delicious. Just basically all you do is you make the same mixture or drink or juice or whatever it is you want, put it in a keg and carbonate it. I mean, it just turns it into a fruit soda, basically. So all kinds of options. The next bit of feedback, our last bit of feedback, comes from our friend Will Allwart, who lives in Atlanta, Georgia. In regards to episode 33 on brewing with roasted grains, he says that he could have listened to the segment on the variation of roasted malts and their uses for another hour. He says he feels like the dark grains are the easiest to overdo in beer, but that the podcast helped out. Well, Will, I'm really glad it was helpful for you. We had fun talking about roasted grains in that show. I feel like roasted grains don't get very much attention. I mean, everyone knows what they are, but the focus isn't really there when it comes to that particular ingredient. So it was a fun show. If anyone out there has ideas as to things that they'd like to hear us focus on more, you can let us know by emailing feedback@brewlosophy.com. You can also leave us feedback by phoning 951-444-0320. Leave us a message. We might play it on the show. That's 951-444-0320. All right. Well, it wasn't too long ago that I started to notice homebrewers talking about this curious concoction they were making that was sort of a half beer, half hard cider hybrid, though it seems to have lost a bit of steam over the last couple of years. Malcolm, are you aware of the history of Graph at all?
Not really. I know friends who make it. And the history, I don't drink it, so I just don't know much about it, man.
So check this out. This is pretty cool. I actually learned this a couple years ago when I was Googling what the hell graph was. So apparently Stephen King, the author of great books such as It and Pet Sematary, he is credited as inventing this beer style. He wrote about it, this just kind of idea, in the Dark Tower series, I guess. And then, of course, curious homebrewers just started making this thing. And in the series, he talked about making a malt, like a wort, basically, and then blending it with cider and fermenting it together. I've never had one, so I was pretty stoked when listener Jeremy Barr sent me one he described as, and I quote, an imperial Belgian graph made with fresh pressed cider from a local cidery he works for. Apparently no water was used in the making of this graph, and he also tossed some apple butter in for kicks. What'd the guys think?
1 minute beer review with Jersey and Tim.
This looks like a standard beer. Color looks right. It's the color of Miller Lite.
It's got some,
It's just a tinge darker than Miller Lite.
a little bit of aroma going.
A little bit of aroma.
Yeah. It's got like,
Don't say apricot.
I'm going to say apricot.
God, you know what?
Or,
You eat one fruit.
all right,
apparently.
shoe leather then.
Okay, I'll go for that. It does have apricot.
I told you. God damn it.
Yeah, I was made to look like a fool. Hashtag same team. All right,
It's
hang
good,
on.
though.
It doesn't look anything weird. Here we go. Whoa, whoa, whoa!
Yeah, it's punny.
That
It's
wasn't
good.
what I expected.
I like it.
Dude, it's like a cider. Whoa, oh, whoa. It's like
Apricot cider.
tons of fruits and stuff. Tastes like there's some apricot in there.
And it's probably not even close.
Wow, dude, that's
I
powerful.
think it's pretty strong, too.
I'm gonna go out there and say I kind of like this. Okay, so it's kind of like a cider. It's less like a beer. It's flavorful. It's powerfully flavorful.
It's good.
It's like every fruit you can find in the grocery store with some booze in there.
It's almost like a little whiskey taste to it, too.
Yeah, maybe. Well, not a whiskey finish, but
Okay.
It starts strong, but then it goes smooth at the end. I endorse this. I would drink this.
I couldn't drink a lot of it.
I
but
wouldn't
would
drink this
it.
over a beer. This probably is a beer. You could feed this to grandma and tell her it's cider.
Go to bed, Grandma.
No, let's dance. Yeah, I like it, but I'm not sure why. It's fruity. It's fruity.
Yeah.
Final thoughts, Timmy Tim.
Well, I'm almost done with this, so that's a good sign.
Yeah, you finished this one relatively quick.
It's palatable.
I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's a beer, if it's a cider, or a cider beer, or something new that we've never even had before. But I like
Yeah,
it.
it's not bad.
The boys are back in town. Not only did they like it, but they seem to hit on a lot of the same characteristics I picked up on. Fruity as all get out, especially apple, and yes, hints of apricot with whispers of cinnamon and pecan. For my first graph, I have to say I was pleasantly surprised. I admittedly thought the whole idea was sort of stupid at first, but I guess that's what I get for prejudging. Jeremy said this graph was built like a triple, so pretty high OG and fermented with Abbey ale yeast, which meant it also had a pretty high ABV. The guys were pretty spot on with that as well. Hey, really good stuff. I'm not sure I'm going to go off and make one just yet, but I love myself some hard cider, and I really like beer. I guess it makes sense that blending the two together would produce a decently drinkable beer. The apple butter thing I thought was really interesting. Maybe it did contribute a little bit to that apple character.
I just vomited in my mouth a little bit.
Dude, when I was reading
will
the
never
description
make
of this,
that. I will never make that.
but I felt the same way before I tasted this thing, Malcolm. That's what I'm trying to say. I was a judger. I was a hater, and this one kind of turned me around. It was quite tasty.
I'll try anything twice, man. I'll try anything twice. So bring it on. But oh my god.
Yeah, there you go. Well, if you've been thinking about making a graph or something like this, maybe you ought to give it a shot. I actually thought it was much more pleasant than I expected. If you want your beer or any other fermented beverage you make or feel like buying and sending to us, reviewed by Jersey and Tim on the show, you can email me, marshall@brewlosophy.com, and we will get you all set up. All right, we got to take a quick break. We'll be back in just a bit to talk all about carbonation.
Compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all grain beer in a single compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free recipe creator tool. Once more, head on over to grainfather.com, that's grainfather.com, and get started today.
Shopping for brewing supplies online can be a real hassle, which is why we recommend Love to Brew. They've got great prices, super fast shipping, and they carry exclusive products like East Coast Yeast, the Brewer's Essentials brand, and their award-winning beer recipe kits. They're also the only place you can pick up your very own Brewlosophy recipe kit. The numbers don't lie. Love to Brew has hundreds of 5-star reviews, and thousands of brewers are choosing them for their supplies and ingredients each year. Experience the difference at lovetobrew.com. That's love, the number 2, brew.com. When dumping wort-soaked grain in leftover low-gravity wort while cleaning up after a brew day, do you ever wonder what your true efficiency would be if that wort made its way to the kettle instead? Using the brew bag, a fabric filter for all mash tuns and brewing methods, allows you to capture every last drop of wort. Not only does this increase kettle efficiency, it lowers your grain bill, which saves you money. Throwing wort in the trash is like dumping a 12-pack down the drain and just doesn't make sense. Use the brew bag and leave no wort behind. I've been using these filters for a long time and recommend them to everyone. I never have to worry about a stuck sparge, and cleanup is fast and easy. Go grab yourself a brew bag fabric filter at brewinabag.com and be sure to use code TBP17 at checkout to get a discount on your order. Water, grains, hops, yeast, they're all required to make beer, but to me what really brings it all together is sipping the finished product, which I believe is made cohesive by a nice bubbly carbonation.
Right, so carbonation on its very basics is just the gas, CO2, dissolved into our beer to form carbonic acid. And then as that hits our mouth, it warms up, and all the imperfections, irregular shapes or whatever of our tongue causes this carbonic acid to come out of solution, and it kind of adds that tickle, tingle, pain sensation that we kind of covet. It refreshes that palate. Wants you to sip some more. But
it hurts so good. It hurts so good.
It actually is part of the trigeminal pain sense, right? So it actually does trigger pain, but somewhat in apparently a pleasing way because we keep going after it.
Right.
And because it is a natural byproduct of fermentation, it's always been part of beer, but perhaps early on, way back, the amount of carbonation would have been very low. So we often talk of carbonation in volumes of CO2, and Europeans will often do in grams per liter, which is almost like double the number. So, if we were to say a normal beer is 2.5 volumes, which means there's, if you have a bottle of beer, there's an equivalent 2.5 times amount of that beer at a given temperature. CO2, that much CO2 is in that beer. So we've dissolved 2.5 bottles worth of CO2 into that beer. Now, if we were to think like beer being made, way before the Middle Ages, and well, certainly further back, but, in modern times sense, it would have been done in a vat and probably open. So the resonant CO2 carbonation in that would have probably been like 0.75 to 1 volume, certainly determined upon the temperature of the liquid. Right now, that is CO2, but it's less than half of what we have. Almost 3 times less than what we have today. So
0.75. I mean, that's 0.75 volumes of CO2 is going to be like taking a sample, taking a hydrometer sample and drinking that, and you just get that very small kind of barely a fizz on your tongue type of thing.
But
right?
You can imagine early man going wait, this is different. Because even having drank only still things, and then all of a sudden this little prickle, it's like, ooh, that's neat. So probably, this is obviously a bit of conjecture, but probably what happened is as they started packaging, and putting things in barrels, some of that leftover fermentable sugar continued to kick off, and it resulted in even higher carbonation, and presumably people enjoyed that even more. So I thought,
Right.
let's replicate this. So, we came to massage it a little bit by, having sturdier barrels, bunging this beer up and capturing that CO2. To
The early
replicate that.
geniuses of our species discovered, what would ultimately become, this component of beer that I just absolutely adore.
Yeah, certainly through trial and error, but they found it pleasing. So and then in probably 1600s or so, when they started manufacturing bottles, it was further refined. How to kreuzen and spunding at the time, what would have been spunding, corking beers earlier than intended for higher carbonation, or dosing some more sugar or yeast, etc. Trying to replicate and reliably create this carbonation effect.
I would imagine that there was some influence, like that the wine industry, particularly champagne, that there was, we kind of learned, brewers, people who were making beer, perhaps kind of picked up some tips from the folks who were making champagne and wine and whatnot, which is, I guess, arguably an older tradition than brewing and beer making. Well,
really, winemakers did everything they could to keep carbonation out of their wine, and it wasn't until I forget his first name, but he went by Dom Perignon. I think it's Pierre or something like that. Perignon, they kind of revolutionized the champagne industry, but that was after beer. Beer was being kegged before that. So,
yeah, that's interesting. Well, there are various different methods that we use for carbonating beer, and we've written about this in an article that we call Sparkle and Fizz. If you want to head over to brewlosophy.com, you can read about that. But why don't we dig into some of these different methods that I think probably the most commonly known one, or the one that most homebrewers end up starting with, is bottle conditioning.
Right. So I started bottle conditioning because at the time I was a poor sailor, begging for change on the streets. We just follow the kit recipe, right? You take your kit and then you take your volume at the end. We didn't even really consider like if it was 4.5 gallons or 5.2 gallons. And we added, I think at the time was like 6 ounces or 3/4 of a cup of sugar. And, it was pretty rudimentary. It was kind of like,
yes, it was,
add this stuff to that. I think we definitely boiled it, made like a syrup to sanitize the sugar, and then added it in, and away it went. I think we mixed it in a bucket, right? That's still done.
Yep.
Mixed it in a bucket, and then apparently oxidizing the hell out of the beer, and then added it to our bottles, and it could have been like 42 bottles or 53 bottles. Didn't matter, and put it away in a closet, and sometimes they would explode, sometimes they wouldn't.
Yeah. When we're talking about the history of like history of carbonation, what was going through my mind was, I wonder how many explosions occurred when the folks who were really trying to narrow in on proper CO2 volumes and how carbonation works and whatnot. What types of, for a fact that there were wood barrels that were just, became bombs basically.
Oh, have you ever heard of the Boston Massacre?
Yeah.
So basically, re-fermented molasses in a big, massive vat in Boston that exploded and like killed people. It's like a tidal wave.
People,
a tidal wave of molasses. So,
dude, carbonation ain't no joke, man.
Yeah.
This shit's it's serious. But yeah. So to break it down, the way when I think about different methods for carbonation, I tend to think in terms of natural and forced. Carbonation in itself is natural. But the underneath each of those, in my mind at least, natural carbonation, forced carbonation, bottle conditioning would fall under that natural one, and there are a few other ones as well. What exactly, when we're talking about natural carbonation, what exactly is happening to produce the bubble in the beer?
Well, yeah. So, it's a byproduct of fermentation, right? So we know for every, verbal stoichiometry here, for every molecule, or I should say mole, for every mole of 6-chain sugar, you more or less have two moles, I should say, 2 moles of ethanol and 2 moles of CO2, right? Now, that's just going to happen. So whether or not it escapes depends if you have an airlock or if it's bunged up. And now,
when yeast consume that sugar is what you're saying. They'll produce 2 moles of carbon of CO2, and what was that
Ethanol.
one?
Yeah, it's like C6H12O6, and so that stoichiometry will say you have 2 C2H5OH plus 2 CO2, right? So stoichiometry, given the inaccuracies and whatever, but it's simple way to explain it. So
Right.
1 mole sugar, 2 moles CO2, 2 moles ethanol. So
Right.
that's going to happen. Now, whether or not it escapes or stays in the vessel depends on what the brewer does. Now, that's going to dissolve into the liquid based upon temperature and pressure plus Henry's constant, which is Henry's law. Now, that takes time, especially if we want that CO2 to become carbonic acid. So if we have some CO2 produced, it kind of goes into that headspace and just stays there. And if we pop that top on the bottle too early, it never really had time to dissolve into the gas, into the liquid and become carbonic acid, right? Mm-hmm. So that's one of the reasons why it's 2 weeks. They say 2 weeks or 3 weeks, whatever. You want to give time for that CO2 to get into solution and stabilize, right?
Right.
Now, when we force carb, you can force carb something in minutes, but you'll notice right away when you pour it, it's kind of like those loose bubbles. It's kind of like fish eyes. And if you shake the beverage, it looks like large bubbles, and it's not really like stable. It just behaves differently. You can kind of see it too when you move the beverage around, So bottle conditioning, one, is easier, but it also takes longer. You have that 2 weeks, and you have to let it stabilize, and
you've got to allow the yeast to consume that sugar and produce the CO2 and the ethanol, small amounts of ethanol, I guess.
Yep. And relatively small amounts of CO2. That's all you need, But the thing is with that with the ease of it, the slapdash method, you can obviously refine it by calculating residual CO2 after fermentation. There's calculators online for all that. You can calculate how much CO2 is left after fermentation. You can calculate how many grams of sugar you want to add to get a certain level of volumes of CO2. That can all be done with online calculators. Now,
and it's based on the volume of beer that you've got, and I believe it's also based on the temperature of that beer, right? Our friend Olin Suddeth over at Brew United has a great calculator that I've used a couple of times to determine the amount of sugar to use for both bottle conditioning and keg conditioning, which is just another form of natural carbonation that you do in the keg. You add the sugar solution to the keg, but they seem to work really well, and allow
accurate.
brewers to really dial in that level of carbonation.
Yep. And with practice, you have to hope that you're at final gravity for sure, because otherwise yeast will consume that sugar too. But so it's an imperfect process unless it's well practiced. But once you always have your routine down, when I brew this beer with this recipe, I always finish at 10-10. Our what is that 2.5 Plato or whatever. I always finish at that, so I know I'm at final gravity for this beer. Then I know I finished at 68 degrees, so I can use that calculator to know how much CO2 is still in that beer. And then I add this much sugar, and we know through science, this many grams of sugar has this percent weight of sugar versus water. And we know how much of that sugar is going to be produced into CO2 and ethanol. So it's crazy. It's all,
Science, man. Yeah.
So
so these conditioning methods, when we're talking about bottle conditioning and keg conditioning, what we're doing is fermenting the beer all the way out until we're, fairly certain that the yeast has puttered out and is done fermenting the sugars that are present in that wort, or that were present in that wort. And then we're adding back another portion of sugar for that yeast to re-kick up to actually re-ferment, which is true secondary fermentation, if you ask me. And then we cap off the package. So all of this stuff using science, we determine the exact amount of sugar to add so that those yeasts can piss out just a little bit more alcohol and fart out a little bit more CO2, and we capture it and we use it to carbonate our beer. Yeah. There's another way that doesn't involve, and it's a form of natural carbonation that doesn't necessarily involve adding extra sugar, because the old Germans said that we're not doing that didn't fit within the Reinheitsgebot. There's a couple ways. One of them is called kreuzening, and the other one is called spunding. Can we talk a little bit about those?
Yeah, so kreuzening is a lot of the same fundamentals, right? You take they call it. I'm gonna mispronounce it, but it's Speiche. I think it's SPEISSE, or it's German for food. So that German word for food is a little bit of yeast and a little bit of residual sugar from wort. They could have a tank, almost like a bioreactor, and they could kreuzen it into their vessel. It's done very traditionally with Hefeweizens.
So what are they, when you say they can kreuzen it? The kreuzen is that fluffy stuff on top of fermenting beer.
But it's also the process of adding.
That's right. Yeah.
Some
so it's
fermenting,
a noun and
some fermenting slurry, if you're liquid, with some residual sugar and active yeast, and you add it back, and you capture the same magic, right? You have a little bit of sugar for the, and then that is a time-honored practice, and obviously if you're a big professional brewery doing it all the time, you have it down to a science. It's a little bit more tricky and fussy for a home brewer, but it can be done. It can be done.
It is being done. We know some people who've a group of people, in fact, who I think are relying on kreuzening quite a bit lately. The other German method that allows one to produce a beer that is absolutely free of anything other than yeast, hops, water, and malt is spunding.
Mm-hmm. And that would be capturing, instead of letting the CO2 blow off into an airlock or whatever, they will put a pressure relief valve set to a certain amount of pressure. With, we'll say, a Plato left, so 4 gravity points left to terminal gravity, which also requires you to have a repeatable process and a predictable process.
Right.
So you have a Plato left to terminal gravity, you cap it, you set your relief valve, and it will naturally carbonate the beer. And it will do so without the threat of oxygen, because even for forced carbonation, you can only get to a certain amount of purity. So at 2 volumes, at 99.995% purity, you're still adding oxygen. Whether or not that bothers you, or if it's to the degree that you think it will affect the flavor, that's a long discussion that we've had in part before, but which I'd love to talk about. But spunding, you're not going to get that. Spunding might be the safest way to preserve the beer from any external exogenous oxygen.
Exposure to oxygen at the very least.
Yeah.
I've not spunded before. I'm very excited to try it. I just built some spunding valves myself. If you could just Google, spunding valve builds, you'll probably, one of the first things you'll see is Sean Terrell's write up about it. That's what I use. That's what I based my builds off of. It's an interesting process that really does allow you to kind of just, use every ounce that you possibly can of the byproduct of brewing for that beer. It's when you said I want to make sure people understand when there's 1 degree Plato left in fermentation, all that means 1 degree Plato is roughly 0.004 SG. So let's say you've got a beer that you're expecting to finish at 1010. When it's at about 1014, you would keg that beer up, close it up in the keg, and you would put a spunding valve on. That spunding valve would be set to a particular PSI, so it would hold that amount, and it would only let off gas anytime it gets higher than that specific amount. So you're giving that beer time to reabsorb the CO2 that it's producing. It's a pretty neat process.
So, some people will shoot the keg with a little bit of CO2 first to make sure the keg is sealed.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I've heard that from most people who spun, actually. But when you think about it, it's not terribly different than forced carbonation. The only difference is with forced carbonation, rather than allowing gas that's created in the beer to release, you're actually putting gas from a canister into the beer. And it's a pretty simple process. There are various ways that people go about forced carbonating. Malcolm, what do you do?
I burst carb now. I've done that mostly for the last 3 or 4 years. So I, bring the beer over. I do purge my kegs first. I fill them up with sanitized water with a little bit of K-Meta to scavenge oxygen. I push that out with CO2, and then I push the beer in with CO2 into the keg, and then I put it to about 45 pounds overnight in a 35 to 38 degree freezer. And then the next day, 24 hours or so later, I put it back down to serving pressure and bleed it off, and it's usually pretty good. But I will say, though, I do see a difference after a few days rather than overnight.
Yeah. So burst carbonation seems to be catching steam among keggers that I'm aware of. I think most of us, as patient as we are, most of us want to start drinking our beer as soon as it's in the keg. And burst carbonation does allow us to do that. My method's a little bit different, but similar. Once I get the beer in the keg, which I do various ways depending on, my mood at the time. Once I get the beer in the keg, though, I'll hit it with, and I purge the headspace with some CO2. I'll hit it with 50 PSI and I'll leave it on overnight. So about 12 hours, maybe 12 to 15 hours. And then I reduce it down to about 15 PSI and let it stabilize until, and I like you, my experience is that after about a week, the carbonation takes on a more normal kind of expected character, but the beer is still drinkable before that. But that's what we're calling the burst carbonation method. I know that there are brew pubs that rely on that. They burst carbonate in their serving tanks or their bright tanks. And so that's where I got the idea from, and I've been using it for years now, and I really like it. There are a couple other methods. Perhaps the easiest one, easiest only because it means you don't have to touch your kegs that often, is the set it and forget it method. It's what I started with, and basically that's you keep all of your gas lines at serving pressure, which is going to result in a very specific, volume of CO2 based on the temperature of your keezer, your kegerator. You pop that disconnect on the keg and you leave it for, in my experience, it took like 10 days to fully carbonate a beer, which is not terribly different than when I was bottle conditioning. But
yeah, I would say it's anywhere from 5 to 10 days, depending on the pressure and the temperature for sure. But the set, sit, and wait thing, it's reliable. It's about a week faster than bottle conditioning or keg conditioning.
Sure.
So that's nice. And I like the fact that if you do have, a little bit of stuff that came over from racking into the keg, rather than keg conditioning, which is usually done in a garage or in a room, you now have to lift it and put it in the keezer. You're going to kick up some of that stuff in the bottom. So right. I do like the aspect of it. It stays there and you leave it there,
Yeah.
Which is one of the downfalls of spunding and keg conditioning. Unless you really, really well lagered and brought nothing over into the spunded keg, you usually can't touch it. It has to stay where it is. That's a disadvantage.
Yeah, I agree with you on that one. Getting that stuff in solution can really become a pain. It's a part of the issue. Like I'm working with these three dudes who live up in Oregon to brew beers for us for HomebrewCon, and they're all going to burst carbonate, and we want to make sure the beers are looking good by the time so you got to you barely move a keg and it seems like it's hazy for the next 5 days. So I agree with you. The other, I think, I'm not sure how popular this method is nowadays, but man, about 6 years ago, it seemed like it was what everybody was doing I call it shake, rattle, and roll, man.
Absolutely. So I've used that method when I want to, serve a beer now, so my father's over, he comes and visits and he's like, hey, where's that mild? And I'm like, Dad, it's still in the fermenter, And he just like gives me that look,
Yeah, easy pop.
So, I'll just go down there and put it in like a half keg and get it cold and then shake the ever living hell out of it, as high as pressure as you feel is comfortable, 25, 40 if you're dangerous.
Yeah. You can easily overcarbonate a beer by shaking it. We were talking earlier about this carbonated water thing. Carbonated water doesn't have any protein, so you're not going to foam over. The more carbonated it is, in my opinion, the better. With beer, that's not the case. If you overcarbonate a beer, you are serving a full glass of foam. I've done this numerous times. That's the reason I don't use this method anymore.
So it works best if you get the whole volume cold. So you get the whole volume of liquid cold in the keg, and then you add pressure to it. Some people will tell you to put 45 pounds on and then remove the connection. And I would say that's safer. And I also say that's not what I do. I leave the gas connected, and I kind of hold onto the gas tube when I roll it with my foot.
Yep.
And that
same boat.
You can do it in 5 minutes. It'll carbonate in 5-10 minutes max.
Easily. And like with burst carbonation as well, in my experience, if that beer is cold and, you go 5 minutes at 40 PSI, you're going to have a carbonated beer. I would suggest you give it an hour in the kegerator, before serving it. 'Cause, you shake up a can of soda and you get foam, you put a shaken keg of beer, in the Keyser, you're going to get a glass full of foam as well. So, but give it some time to settle. It does seem, I mean, it works, and I do know people are still doing it. Another kind of hybrid version of this, if you want to, like a smaller sample of beer, is to get one of those carb caps, which are really convenient. You can actually put completely still beer in like a 2-liter soda bottle, put a carb cap on, hit it with some gas and shake the living hell out of it, and you'll have a carbonated beer in, I think that only takes like 30 seconds or a minute or something like that.
I'll do this when for like picnics, or if I want to have some friends of mine try a beer for me and give me some eval. I'll take it, put it in a bath of ice water and just spin it. And that little 2-liter bottle or even a 1-liter bottle will go from, room temp to nearly freezing in under a minute. So you just, a slurry of ice and water, you spin the beer. When I fill it up, I fill it all up to about an inch below the top, and then I squeeze the rest of the space so it's kind of collapsed on itself. I put the cap on, I get it cold, and then I hit it with CO2. Then I start spinning it some more while it's cold with the high pressure on it. Spin it in that ice solution, bring it out, hit the gas again. It usually takes some more gas because some of it has gone into solution. And yeah, I've gotten a beer carbonated in just a few minutes that way.
Yeah, so I've never used a carb cap. I've had beers that were carbonated using a carb cap, and I think it's great. I would totally use them all the time if somebody would just make a pin lock version. All I ever see are these ball lock carb caps. I keep looking. So, hey, anybody out there who want, there's a lot of us pin lock users out here who are feeling left out. I would really like a pin lock carb cap. So there are, we've kind of went over some of the pros and cons of all of these different methods. I think, one of the big pros spoken about natural carbonation methods is that you're allowing the yeast more time to scrub out any oxygen that may have ingressed during the packaging process. I'm not totally convinced that is as certain as some people speak of it as being. I think some of the pros of forced carbonation obviously is just reduced amount of time to get that beer carbonated, so you're drinking your beer sooner. Yeah. There's some contention that forced carbonated beer can typically be clearer faster. I know that I've had plenty of super clear bottle conditioned beer as well. So, any other pros and cons?
Well, I would like to say that the yeast is consuming oxygen. That is not something that's up for debate. But
no,
whether or not it
that
matters
is happening.
Is,
I know
is
that.
something we can talk about now.
Right.
So the what do you want to call it? Like the lees or the trube, mini trube, in the bottom of a bottle conditioned beer. That can be an issue, right? I've had lots of home brews that, I say are hazy in a competition and talk to the brewer later, and it was crystal clear. I'm like, well, I don't think the cellarmen or stewards were juggling them, but just in the act of carrying it over, unless you have it down to a science, like Sierra Nevada does, and they have that little tiny ring of yeast at the bottom. Unless you have it down to a science, it's very easy to overdo and bring over too much yeast and have too much sediment in your bottles.
Yeah.
So it does take some skill, and it can be done. Obviously, the Belgians and Sierra Nevada seem to have it down. But that is an issue, the potential hazy beer. Predictability. I like the predictability of forced carb. Using one of those charts, you can get it from Kegworks or any go use your favorite search engine for carbonation chart. It'll tell you this temperature at this pressure equals this many volumes. You're done. With some time component there, of course.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of that stuff at the bottom of the bottle conditioned bottle or keg. It has the potential for reaction. It's a reaction site, so it can autolyze if it's yeast. It can oxidize if it's proteins and fats. And even though the yeast that's live in the bottle might have some preservative aspect, I think at some point that goes off the cliff and it becomes a liability.
Yeah.
So there's that. And
I think one of the biggest cons to bottle conditioning is that the risk of creating basically little miniature bombs. You can make the most contaminated beer possible and put it in a keg, and you're relatively safe. Not from if you drink it, you might not like the way it tastes, but at least your keg's not going to explode in the Keyser. You kill anybody.
Yeah.
But yeah, you know, one of the things that I like about forced carbing is that it just reduces so much risk. The packaging process takes, in my experience, takes much less time. You're filling one vessel as opposed to filling one vessel and then going to fill 50 other little vessels, and no capping or anything like that. So, but we've done a few experiments focused on the differences between various methods of carbonating beer. We'll be getting into those results as soon as we're back. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer, and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com. And be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD. That's BRUPOD at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. Founded in 1978 by brewing pioneer Charlie Papazian, the American Homebrewers Association is a division of the Brewers Association focused specifically on protecting and promoting the hobby of homebrewing. In addition to their work lobbying for the rights of homebrewers across the country, they're also the primary sponsor of Brewlosophy.com. By joining the AHA, not only are you supporting their cause, but you get a ton of benefits as well. Discounts at brewers across the U.S., early access to tickets for events like the Great American Beer Festival, and you get to attend HomebrewCon, the world's biggest gathering of homebrewers. Head over to Brewlosophy.com/AHA now to sign up to become a member. Well, there seems to be a lot of opinions out there as to the way different methods of carbonating actually impact beer. So we wanted to put it to the test just to see for ourselves.
Yeah, you know, it's funny because there's so much text now available to us as far as like, you know, brewing science. And on the subject of bottle conditioning or natural conditioning of beer, there's still a lot of like anecdotal, you know, belief, dogma, which is part of brewing, and I get that, and that's part of the fun. But, you know, we have some people who are pretty well known in the beer industry who quote things such as this, and I'll just I'm pulling this from the Oxford Companion to Beer. It says, when done properly, bringing beer into condition via bottle conditioning will result in the beer with a finer, silkier texture of carbonation for a superior foam retention, more complex flavors, longer shelf life, and better aging ability than beers that are forced carbonated. So that's from Garrett Oliver, who, you know, is an idol of
Brooklyn.
mine as far as, you know, he speaks eloquently, he writes eloquently, from Brooklyn Brewing. And, I mean, you know, widely considered a pretty smart guy. And at the same time, there is no science to back that up. You know.
Yeah. Well, we tried to test it out. I mean, we tried to put some science out there for it, at least on the homebrew level.
Right. So our first experiment was carbonation methods, forced carbonation versus keg conditioning. Ray found, and he wanted to put that exact belief to a test. You know, and basically brewed a beer that was is that Mac IPA, a 10-gallon batch that he split between two carboys, treated in the same except for the variable on this one. Right, which was forced conditioned one keg and naturally carbonated the other by, instead of doing the sugar in a bucket and mixing it, he did the sugar in a sugar solution in a keg. and then he stored them both for equal amount of time, and then allowed them to the natural one to come into condition while the other one was held at room temperature, right?
Yeah, we wanted to make sure to control for the temperature of the beers.
Right.
So what he did is he determined, how much he was going to need, how much gas he was going to need to put on the forced carb beer to reach 2.7 volumes of CO2. And then he also, he used that Brew United calculator to determine how much sugar to use in the keg conditioned beer to produce 2.7 volumes. So those would be the same. And then to control for temperature, he stored even the forced carb beer out, in the same environment as he did the natural carbed beer, and then moved them to the keezer at the same time as well, and force carbonated at that point. Yeah. I feel like it was a pretty well controlled experiment in that respect.
Yeah, as best as we can do in garages, and targeted 2.7 volumes, and then he served it to 15 people. And so at 15 people, we would have needed to have 9 people to accurately identify the odd beer. So I think they were given 2 samples of the keg conditioned and 1 sample of the forced in opaque cups like we normally do. However, only 6 people were able to identify which beer was the different beer.
Which is one more than 1/3, and
Right.
1/3 is what you'd expect if people were just randomly guessing. So we can look at this and say, at least in this, this one specific experiment and this one single data point shows us that the participants in this experiment were unable to reliably tell apart, the forced carbonated beer from the one that was naturally carbonated in a keg.
Right, and this one kind of surprised me because I would have thought we would have gotten the whole, smaller bubbles thing. But really, in this case, the naturally conditioned beer was able to sit for quite a long time. So it was able to somewhat replicate that long dissolving of the gas into solution, to create that, I think, more stable CO2.
Yeah.
It's really hard to replicate 2 or 3 days of carbonation versus 2 weeks of carbonation because of that time element.
Yeah. Well, and also I believe Ray let the beers sit in his keezer for about a week after forced carbonating, and he used a burst carbonation method for this, so that one was stabilized as well. And ultimately, what these results seem to be saying is that, if you want to naturally carbonate in the keg, maybe save a little bit of money on purchasing CO2, that it's producing a beer with similar character as a forced carbonated beer. There was a difference in appearance, and I know, Malcolm, you kind of are curious as to why that naturally conditioned beer didn't seem to drop as clear as the forced carbonated one. But my experience has been that natural conditioning tends to produce an at least somewhat hazier beer than forced carbonating.
Yeah, that's opposite to my experience. I bottle conditioned for a long time, several years, and my beers were always crystal if given the proper conditioning temperatures and time. And especially if you use there's I think it's called CBC yeast. It's basically cask conditioning. That stuff is so sticky, and it just drops out like a brick, and it will stick to the bottom of the glass as long as you do the proper dosing rate, which it tells you in the back of the darn package. You follow the directions.
Why follow rules though, Malcolm? Come on, man.
So follow the directions. I know it's a crazy idea for a guy, but follow the directions. And that beer, provided the beer itself is not hazy, mind you, given that caveat. But if the beer would otherwise drop clear, it should drop clear. Also, by the way, you can add your findings when you condition. So you can add your findings if you want to do gelatin or isinglass or whatever it is you want to do. You can add that when you add the priming and the yeast.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, speaking of bottle conditioning, we wanted, we've been, that first experiment was comparing keg conditioning. So carbonating the entire batch in a keg, which I've only done twice, and it worked great both times. But, I didn't do a comparison. Ray did. We wanted to compare typical, new homebrewer bottle conditioning to forced carbonation. And so for this one, contributor Jake Houlihan brewed up a 10-gallon batch of Saison, which I thought was, that's good because Saison is one of those styles sort of known prefer being bottle conditioned. It's one of those styles that I know a lot of homebrewers who still will take the time to bottle condition because they feel like it gives it particular characteristics. So he split this 10-gallon batch of Saison between 2 carboys, fermented them at the same temperature. Treated them exactly the same with the exception of packaging or until packaging. One of the batches was force carbonated while the other was bottle conditioned. Same treatment as Ray did. He wanted to try to control for temperature and all of that stuff. Jake blended. He has an interesting way of bottling these beers. He actually blended the sugar and the beer in a keg, and then he used a Blickman beer gun to fill up the bottles from there. Hey, if you got the stuff, might as well use it. I think most people would end up racking it to a bottling bucket and bottling that way, but still. That's how he got those bottles filled. He then served these beers to 26 participants, 14 of whom would have to correctly identify the odd beer out in order for us to say that it was significant. And corroborating the results from Ray's first experiment on natural carbonation, only 12 people selected the unique sample in the triangle test, indicating that they were unable to reliably tell these beers apart. This one, this was one where I was in my head, I was like, this is going to be an easy, significant experiment. And in talking with Jake about, these beers, he was a little bit surprised with the results because he did say that, being totally biased and aware of the variable, that he was able to kind of tell the beers apart fairly consistently in his own blind trials. Though he did admit that it was much more difficult than he expected. He described the bottle conditioned beer as being, quote, gritty and rustic, which he said that's kind of what he prefers in Saison. While the force carbonated beer just tasted fresher and brighter on his tongue. Yet another, potential good thing for a lot of beer styles, at least when you're force carbonating. Pretty interesting results.
Yeah, and I tend to agree with a lot of the Belgian and Saison. I think there's something, not magical. It's it's predictable in the bottle because we give these yeast inputs and they excrete predictable, more or less predictable outputs. And you take the yeast and you put them in a bottle with a little bit more food, and you put them away for 2 weeks. I think they're going to inject some character, some metabolites. So they're going to metabolize some of the things that are already in the beer, and they're going to excrete some more things due to the natural fermentation process into the beer. So phenols, esters, etc.
Right.
I think without that, this is completely me just doing the same thing I was accusing other people doing. I'm romancing, but that's part of the fun of beer,
Yeah, man.
I don't know if it's real. I don't know if what because here, I believe, Jake's results, but when I do bottle conditioning, especially with Belgian and Saison, which is Belgian, but I seem to have a little bit of a character that I actually prefer and enjoy.
Yeah. Well, and I don't think it's far-fetched to say that when you're adding something additional to a beer, sugar water, and for some people, another yeast strain like CBC, like you were talking about, that it's going to produce at least some sort of a difference. One of the things about data like this is that it's not saying that for a fact bottle conditioning doesn't produce a difference from force carbonating. That's not at all what this is saying. What it's saying is that in this particular experiment, not enough tasters were capable of distinguishing the beers for us to say that they are super different, that they are very, very different.
Yep.
But, when there's an element, we've been talking a little bit about running some triangle test trials where the participants are made completely aware of the variable, and just to see, how that impacts their ability to tell the beers apart, kind of narrow down their focus a little bit. And maybe that will change the way we view beer evaluation in terms of the triangle test that we're doing. But, these results are interesting. And at the very least, I think at least provides some validation for those who maybe can't jump into kegging, saying, hey, you can make a beer of equal quality by using the bottle conditioning method as opposed to forced carbonation. Well, we did one more experiment on natural carbonation. But before we get to that, I want to remind you all about how awesome Imperial yeast is. In the last week alone, This is no joke. I've heard from 6 people. I went back and counted my emails. I've heard from 6 people who've said that they've decided to try it out based on our recommendation, and every single one of them had nothing but good to say. With 200 billion cells of the purest yeast in every pitch right pouch, fermentation kicks off fast, finishes quickly, and results in the delicious beer that you plan to make. With clean strains like Flagship, lager strains like Global and Urkel, and everything else in between, Imperial Yeast is sure to have everything that you need to make the beer that you want. Check out everything they have to offer at imperialyeast.com, and you can pick up their product at both Great Fermentations and More Beer, the links of which we have on our support page. All right, so our final experiment on natural carbonation that we've gotten to, that we're going to get to in this episode at least, was comparing forced carbonation to spunding, which we talked about in the last segment a little bit. I was really interested in this one as somebody who's never tried the whole spunding method.
Yeah, and I really like this one too. And I like the fact that I really encourage people to go, well, read all of our experiments, of course, but this one in particular, Jake did a great job of, talking about the Reinheitsgebot and how it applies, using this method to the best of his ability and using spunding, so bunging, because spund is the German word for bunging, basically corking up the beer, towards the end of the process to make use of that natural carbonation. And he references Kai Troister's site, which gives us a handy calculation. And I don't want to belabor you with those, so please go read the experiment. But essentially, he calculated how much CO2 he would have left over, as we discussed earlier. He calculated at what point he would need to spund. So he bunged it up and tried to capture about 2.4 volumes in a German pale lager, or a Helles. And so it's a Helles-inspired recipe for sure. And he captured one via spunding for 2.4 volumes, and then he also force carbonated the other for targeting 2.4 volumes. And in the end, ended up serving to 22 people. So 2 people, everyone was given 2 samples of the force carbonated and 1 sample of the spunded beer. And at that sample size, 12 people would have been required to identify the unique beer for a significant result. And we got exactly 12 people.
Exactly 12 participants were able to identify the odd beer out, which allows us to say, at least using the statistic that we do, that there was a distinguishable difference between these beers, at least enough so that enough people were able to tell it apart for us to reach that significance threshold. Fascinating result to me.
Always one of the more interesting aspects of these significant results, at least in my opinion, is the preference. So I always love, looking at what people preferred, because different is one thing, but preference is another. And I think they had 5 people reported preferring the force carbonated, while 2 liked the spunded, which was the opposite of what I would have assumed, especially given the potential for oxidizing, so I would have thought the fresher beer would have been more preferred. And 3 people would have reported, or had reported, having no preference. So, and 2 people reported no difference. So no preference, no difference, and 5 people liked the forced carbed.
I think I always wonder. I hate that preference question. I mean,
I know you do. I do.
The only thing I like about it is when it just it's like consistently shows us that preference is generally subjective, right? It kind of proves that over and over again, especially when we see these significant experiments returning preference results that are split basically down the middle. But, I think with something like spunding versus forced carbonation, a part of me wonders if the preference for the forced carbonation beer, which, by the way, when they take this, when they answer this preference question, they're still blind to the variable. They have no clue what's going on, and they're told to compare just the 2 beers that are different. We tell them to move, one of the colored cups, and they're comparing these 2 beers that are different. There's part of me that wonders if they were indeed capable of, they actually did notice this difference, if their preference wasn't just in line with what they're used to, because there are not very many spunded beers here in the States that I'm aware of.
Right. So that's why I find the question so interesting. And, to use another example, a different experiment, of course, but the extract, right? So the extract aged versus new extract, it was significant, and those beers were starkly different in appearance and flavor, but people without any pretext preferred the old extract because it was flavorful and bold, and it tasted like a Scottish beer, in my opinion. Whereas
they weren't primed to know, that beer was made with old ass extract.
I didn't say which is the better Helles or which is the better Helles Extra.
Right.
I said which one do you prefer? No pretext whatsoever. So in this case, they weren't asked which one is fresher. They were asked which one do you prefer.
Exactly. Man, Malcolm, you and I were talking recently about doing a show just on bias and beer. I think we're going to have to plan a few of those out because that could be a really fun and heated conversation, I imagine. Well, with these experiment results that we've got, what are your thoughts on the different methods for carbonation? You going to change your ways or stick to what you've been doing?
Well, I'm a kind of an in between on this stuff. So most of the time I'll go for what's easy, and for some beers, I don't think it matters as much. It's like the whole, whispering in a church versus whispering in a concert mentality of mine.
Right.
But when I'm really trying to really go for it, and I'm really trying to nail a Helles, I go the extra mile, and I do enjoy the fussiness of it. I do enjoy spunding. I do enjoy that aspect of trying to perfect a beer and do everything I can to do the best by the beer, really, really capture the malt versus the honey characteristics that I sometimes find in a lot of even very good lagers here in the U.S.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. I know Jake said that he detected kind of a honey-like aroma in the force carbonated beer that he felt was kind of absent in the spunded beer. Yeah. And despite the fact that, the force carbonated beer won the preference of slightly more of the participants who were correct on the triangle test, I'm excited to try it for myself. It's one of those like old methods I think ostensibly it's easier than what we're doing now because you're just capping a keg with a valve and letting it finish its thing.
It actually can be easier. That's one of the things that we talk about a lot with short and shoddy and et cetera. It's like just simplify. Now some aspects of oxygen mitigation can be considered more fussy and more laborious, but this aspect certainly does not have to be. You just measure the beer, and go, okay, now's the time. Bring it over to a keg and cap it. Forget it, Yeah, and you can do it all cold. You don't have to spund warm. You can continue to spund cold, just like a German brewer would. You basically continue to lager.
That's right. During the lagering phase is when the spunding valve gets added. That's basically, and you're doing a slow reduction in temperature. That was kind of the whole point back then.
Yep.
Well, I think it's fascinating. I absolutely do plan on trying out some spunding. I'm not sure I'm going to be bottle conditioning anytime soon, only because I hate the process of packaging, whether it's kegging or bottling. So the less amount of time it takes, the better for me. But that's all I've got on natural carbonation and forced carbonation at this point. Malcolm, you got anything else you want to say?
Yeah, I encourage people, if you haven't bottle conditioned or spunded in a long time, go back and try it. If not, to at least remind yourself that you hate it and further enjoy.
Keep yourself humble, right?
Kegging. Yeah. But you might find that you like it, and you might find there's something different. Who knows?
Yeah, a little bit of zen from it. Well, if you want to read more about the experiments we discussed in this episode or any of the other stuff we're up to, you can head over to Brulosophy.com. The Brulosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to Brulosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit Patreon.com/Brulosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brulosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it suits my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more. Life is good, the likelihood of me. Looking for a new career? Welcome to Do HVAC Training Service Center in North Charleston. Enroll today in our comprehensive HVAC training hands-on field experience-based program, covering troubleshooting, maintenance, installation, and more on various HVAC systems and ductwork. We offer EPA and NAEP preparation and testing, along with various certifications. Enjoy payment options. Achieve certification in under 5 months. Enroll now for your new journey of skill development and career advancement. Log on to DEWHVACTrainingsc.com to inquire.